Okay, I think people will probably still be dropping in, but we can get started because I know this is a really interesting, hopefully, topic for everyone. And I'm so pleased to see how many people have joined us. I will say it's going to be a trick for me because I haven't been working with this many attendees in a long time, so I got to try to remember what I'm doing. So welcome everyone to our Maine Speaks lecture called Great Grief, Mourning and Remembrance in New England. I see folks are still dropping their intros in the chat, which you are welcome to do as you're joining. My name's Cynthia Walker. I'm the Executive Director of the Brickstore Museum here in Kennebunk. And I want to thank the Maine Humanities Council for their support of this program and so many other Maine voices across the state. And of course, our speaker today, Professor Bischoff, for all of her time and knowledge. The Brickstore Museum focuses on the stories and experiences of people who both historically and currently live here in Kennebunk and the surrounding area. And to do that, we've been working the past several years on discussing mental health and its effects through time. And during those conversations, we often speak about grief and the ways that we remember people. There are many different experiences that we may or may not experience in our own lifetime, but we are guaranteed that grief and loss is something that we each go through at some point or another. This program today is kicking off a year-long project here at the museum exploring how we remember those we love, which will result in a collaborative community exhibition. I invite you to follow along and join in when you can. You can find out the next steps in our project on our website at brickstoremuseum.org. Not yet, but soon. You gotta give me a moment to put it on, but it'll be there. So let's turn to our program today. I first heard our speaker, Libby Bischoff, speak on this topic almost 10 years ago. And her message stuck with me and changed my perspective on how humans process grief. I'm really happy to have her join us on this snowy day. Libby is professor of history at the University of Southern Maine and executive director of the Osher Map Library and Smith Center for Cartographic Education. As if that wasn't enough to do, she is also a published author, is a speaker, obviously, with Maine Humanities Council, and specializes in 19th century American culture and Maine history. So without further ado, Libby, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. Welcome, everyone. I am going to share my screen, and then we will get started. I would also invite you this afternoon, if you would like, to keep using the chat. There may be things that you see that you want to react to. I love saving the chat at the end of a Zoom and see what people are thinking. And then we'll also use that at the end to have a discussion. This talk is very much past and present, and it's really interesting to hear that Cynthia heard me talk about this 10 years ago. And for others who did, there might be some familiar things, but there's a lot that shifted. And a lot of that is due to the historical period that we are living in together. So good afternoon and welcome. Thank you to the Brickstore Museum for partnering with the Maine Humanities Council to host this illustrated talk on this very snowy afternoon, especially to Cynthia Walker, to Liz Sinclair, and thank you also to the interpreters who have joined us this afternoon. And I'm really glad that everybody can be safe and warm at home today while you listen. My task today, which is self-imposed, I had no tasks from Liz and Cynthia, but my task today is not to cover the full array of mourning practices in 18th and 19th century New England. That would really be impossible. It would take a book. Maybe I'll write that one someday, not anytime soon. But to talk about some of the customs that were practiced and performed in honor of the deceased, especially those that involve a more public display of grief. So we will talk about, to that end, mourning jewelry, sometimes fashioned from the hair of the deceased. We will look at postmortem photography and mourning clothing, as well as many other public expressions of grief. I also am putting forth an argument today, and I'll keep coming back to it, that in the loss of some of these mourning customs over time, I think that we've become further alienated from processing death and grief, and also in knowing what to do to give comfort to those who are experiencing loss. And I think generationally, that's even more profound, especially as so many, like I have a 10-year-old and a 26-year-old, so many of our kids have never been to a wake or a funeral or participated in any public form of grief. And so we'll talk more about that as we move on today. And so by way of an introduction and to more fully immerse ourselves in these customs that we'll talk about this afternoon, it's really important to highlight some of the similarities and distinctions between our 21st century culture and the mourning practices of those in the 18th and 19th centuries. So I'll give a bit of a general overview, hitting upon some common mourning practices. But, I'm a public historian, I'm a 19th century historian. To access the past, we really have to put aside our preconceived notions and expectations and immerse ourselves in the practices of another time. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do today. And to access these mourning practices, we turn to items and objects, letters and diaries, etiquette books, so many etiquette books. I will performatively read some of those later. Newspaper advertisements, fiction, poetry, literature, photographs, and even some legislation around mourning practices. So we have to lay aside any potential feelings of distaste we might have at the use of using human hair as treasured jewelry, or our notions of being creeped out, as my students often are, at the practice of postmortem photography. We have to instead try and understand why it was so important for our ancestors to keep tangible reminders of the departed living among them in the present. And that's, thinking about this notion of great grief. That's really what the image you can see on screen is right now, which was actually embroidered by a 13-year-old girl in Boston, Massachusetts, sacred to the memory of her own father. So she is performing and processing her own grief through a physical act of needlework. We'll talk about this more later, while also honoring the dead. And in a bit of a difference from some of the other beautifully wrought mourning portraits of this time, she has also included others in the graveyard with her father. But she has placed herself centrally. We can't see her face, but she has placed herself centrally in this image. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that looks like. I think it's also really important to acknowledge today together that we're talking about grief today during a time period in which we are, quote, awash in grief from the global COVID-19 pandemic, a watershed moment in history, which we are still living through and from which we are still reeling. I was really taken by this visual and textual exploration of COVID-era long grief that was published in Reuters just a few weeks ago. It's on the screen right now, just the beginning of it. And so it's this beautiful, also I love cyanotypes, they're my favorite photographs, so it's probably why I was visually taken with it as well. But it's this beautiful kind of long read, scroll through artistic meditation on death and COVID grief. And one of the arguments that is coming up in the article is when a person experiences prolonged grief, the original intensity following a loss persists and can interfere with day-to-day life for years afterwards. So for those of us still here, what does it mean to have confronted death in a time of unprecedented social change? And I sit with that question as well. What does it mean to do this. And I can absolutely put the link for this in the chat towards the end of the presentation so you can explore it as well. So in March of 2020, as a public historian, I embarked upon a digital project to document and archive signs throughout Southern Maine during the pandemic. And one of the things that I did, and I'm more than happy to talk about this project another time, but it's a little different from what we're doing today. But I wanted to share this particular image. This is from the 2020-2021 holiday season. This is the town common of the very small town of Sebago, Maine, on the lake. And they chose to make their Christmas tree that year a pandemic memorial on which they placed a heart ornament for every Mainer who had died from COVID-19 up until that point. And this, to me, I mean, it really stopped me in my tracks. And yes, I drove around Southern Maine for months taking photographs of pandemic signs, but that's a story for another time. But I spent a long time at this memorial. During lockdown, I drove a lot. That was my escape because I could, especially like around the Lakes region where I live. And I spent a really long time at this memorial. And it really struck me, also, it's so Maine, right? Like 2 wooden stakes, a handwritten sign, these gorgeous fiery red heart ornaments. And it really struck me as this signifier of public mourning. And I think it stopped me in my tracks because we hadn't seen too many signifiers of public mourning before the pandemic. And in a time when people couldn't gather, they did this instead. And I'm really interested to to think about the ways in which that's stuck with us. So as Cynthia mentioned in her introduction, this program is the kickoff, and I'm honored to be doing that for this year-long project at the Brickstore Museum that's going to think about and explore how we remember those we love, and which will result in my favorite kind of exhibit, which is a collaborative community exhibit. So to that end, we've selected some items from the museum's collections that will be featured at different points in time today. And when relevant, I've featured them alongside parallel contemporary expressions. I want to thank the museum volunteers who kindly recorded readings of selected 19th century poems and letters from the archives, some of which we'll play today. Others you can listen to later. Cynthia can pop that link in the chat. And I'm often really struck by the ways when you're planning a talk, and for me, in my day job, planning a talk happens sometimes very close to the talk itself. But the things that cross your path that you really need to see, like when you're thinking about something and you're awakened to the sensibility, things appear. And that happened to me this week when I happened upon Maine poet Gibson Fay LeBlanc's newly published poem, Lorca Says the Duende Loves the Rim of the Wound, which reckons with COVID-era grief and loss in collaboration with the artist Lauren Woods. And it was just published this week. And so I paired Gibson's poem. Many of you may know him. He's also the director of the Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance. I paired Gibson's poem with an anonymous 19th century poem on grief and loss from the Brickstore Museum. And so as we begin this exploration today, I'd like to just listen to them both kind of without comment and note that they're written nearly 200 years apart. So I'm going to stop sharing for a second just so I can reshare and so you can listen. Gibson's poem, the way it was published, was actually in collaboration with an embodied movement artist, Lauren Woods. So as you listen to them read the poem, you're actually going to see her artistic response. It's deeply meditative.
Lorca says the duende loves the rim of the wound. There's a small crater in your chest. Your breath falls into at grief o'clock. It's like a section of paddock fence blew down in a nor'easter, and now your heart just keeps running unguarded.
No going back to a previous body.
No tagbacks we used to say.
This tuning fork vibrates forever after it's struck.
They call a storm like that a microburst.
You will never praise what happened. Two beloveds gone from their bodies during those long months when hospitals were overrun with the dead.
No, you're not able to love the crater or the crater's edge.
Maybe the edge of the edge. The pebbly skin the wind catches on and ripples.
Place like the mutt you rescued and feed and walk, who 7 years later still growls sometimes at your touch.
You stroke his scraggly black hair, avoiding his black eyes.
You keep each other alive.
And then I also want to play the anonymous poem on death, written nearly 200 years before, also in Maine.
I would not longer live, mother. Earth has no charms for me. Since ties which bound me captive here are now dissolved, I'm free. The world looked brightly once, mother, as fair as summer sky. I thought its joys would never fade, its pleasures never die. But now the dream is past, mother, and with it joy has fled. I clasped the phantom up to my heart till hope's last ray was dead. You tell me, in that brighter world, our hearts are never riven, that happiness is not of earth, but found alone in heaven. I feel that clamps of death, mother, are gathered on my brow, and yet I do not cling to earth, I would not linger now. Then lay me in my grave, mother, in some secluded spot, where I may rest in peacefulness, by all but thee forgot.
And so as we think about these two, to their times, very contemporary expressions of grief, we think, we sort of keep these with us as we move into looking at some of the other ways that people publicly shared their grief. And so before we talk more about the importance of mourning the dead and the lost, we should briefly look at how death was understood in the 18th and 19th centuries. Death and dying were and remain both individual experiences and social experiences. And so for colonial Americans of the 1700s, death was communal, as was grief. Cemeteries, you can see the Old York burying yard here, cemeteries, which they referred to as burial grounds, burial yards, or graveyards, were often located near town commons in New England. And so they actually really served as constant reminders of death's frequent presence in these close and tight-knit communities. Thoughts about your mortality influence day-to-day life, and you actually can't understand the Puritans unless you really take that to heart. You're always thinking about death. That death was inevitable and final were widely accepted premises. Puritans neither worshipped nor praised the dead. Bells rang to announce deaths. Funeral processions to grave sites were common, though no words were uttered typically, nor sermons preached for the dead in earliest days. African-American colonial practices in New England and elsewhere tended to differ from these solemn processions. And I'll ask my delightful colleague, Ashley Toll, to drop the link to her new book in the chat if you would actually like to read more about that. But as Mark Sammons and Valerie Cunningham explained in their study, Black Portsmouth, 3 Centuries of African-American Heritage in New Hampshire, in the West African funeral tradition, funeral processions were accompanied by music, first passing each house in a village to provide the corpse an opportunity to signal any malefactors. At the grave, family and community made offerings and celebrated the prospect of rebirth. Some of these customs carried over into New England. Euro-Americans were startled and sometimes irritated by meandering funeral processions, music, and celebration. In 18th century Boston, a series of laws and statutes were actually passed to stop Black funeral processions from wending about the town and to enforce less raucous observances. And so this celebratory character was actually diminished over time in New England as many African Americans adopted the practices of their Christian churches in this part of the world, but never fully, right? And those leaving offerings for the dead, public expressions of grief, those remain here and elsewhere. And so these differences in grieving and mourning remind us that even when we're talking about common mourning practices of the 18th and 19th centuries, it's essential to really take into account the notion that these practices really vary by race, by ethnicity, by religious denomination, and by socioeconomic status. So in the 1800s, as populations in New England grew, as the Industrial Revolution really burgeoned, immigration heightened, populations began this slow shift from rural to urban areas, death becomes less communal and it becomes more individualized. So certainly the dead were still mourned by their communities, but the expressions of grief within a deceased individual's family becomes more emphasized. So the 19th century witnesses this shift from a focus on the dead to a focus on the mourner and the mourning process. And I think this is a really important shift, and you see it in visual culture, which is the thing I like to talk most about as an historian. So that's where I see it. You also, I'm sure you see it in the text, but I don't pay as much attention to that. But you really see it in the visual culture until like you see this daguerreotype portrait of a seated woman in full mourning dress and bonnet in Boston by Southworth and Hawes. This is actually part of a collection of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. That this is a photograph for the living and of the living. Like this is a very performative expression of grief. And so 19th century Americans, particularly those of the middle class, were really obsessed with mourning their dead, because in their sentimental scheme of social status, the capacity to experience grief like really demonstrates their gentility. So grief was deeply felt, certainly, and I don't mean to argue that people weren't feeling it, because they were feeling it, but it's also performed. And I think it's this performance of grief that's really interesting. Wearing mourning clothing and jewelry were poignant expressions of personal grief. But the donning of these items were also social and public rituals, and there's absolutely ritual involved in them. Mourning garments were a show of respect for the dead, but they were also an external and an outward indication to others that one had suffered a loss and that sober feelings were appropriate. But you could also hide behind them as a mourner. You could be shielded from dealing with the public because people would look at you and they would know. And I think that's really a piece that we are missing. We do not know when people are in mourning right now. There's no signifier, right? And so this actually signified an approach, a caution, and the clothing represented 4 different stages of mourning, which we'll talk about later. So you really could say, oh, they're in first mourning, proceed with caution. They're in second mourning, they're coming out of mourning. These clothes signified these things. I would say common to both eras, the 18th and the 19th century, certainly up until the Civil War, was where death typically occurred, which was in the home, surrounded by families and friends who watched the final moments, heard a person's last words, this was very important, and who then handled the preparation of the body and the burial arrangements. And you can see that this is just a Harper's Weekly illustration exemplifying the notion of a good death surrounding family at home, thinking about George Washington on his deathbed in Virginia. Those from home carried their dead to burial, often in simple boxes built of cedar and pine. Sometimes they made these boxes, sometimes they purchased them from places like S.S. Rich and Son, Coffins and Undertakers on Exchange Street in Portland. But all of this changed with the public's acceptance of embalming during the Civil War, which was really a necessity when thousands of men were dying so far from home. So the professionalization of death outside the home really takes root during the Civil War in the 1860s, and it only escalates throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Death becomes more bureaucratic, the ways of treating and caring for the dead more standardized, and the corpse became a commodity, right? Because there was so much buying and selling around the process of death. And you can see this here. This is a later picture from Portland in 1900. This is an advertisement for John S. Cushman, who was a funeral director and practical embalmer. I don't really know what an impractical embalmer is, but he's a practical embalmer on Federal Street. And you can see it's a really large, prominent storefront in the business district of Portland. And this too was a business. In his book, The Sacred Remains, American Attitudes Towards Death, Gary Laderman explains that before the 1880s, no funerary industry existed to provide goods and services for the dead or the survivors in any uniform or dependable manner. So family members, friends, neighbors, these were the people who were responsible for the actions that led to the burial of the dead. Undertakers, liverymen, cabinet makers, all offered assistance at various moments in the transferal of the dead from the living community to the grave, but they usually played a subsidiary role in what Laderman argues is the drama of death. And you see that here with S.S. Rich and Son. It's a much simpler storefront. He's making coffins and he's literally providing the livery cab to drive someone. There's no services performed. It's just literally the transportation. And so this is what you can see really, really grow and change. And so to this end, it's really interesting to know that the National Funeral Directors Association was founded in 1882. Cremation begins to gain popularity in the United States in the mid-1870s. And so I'd like to think a little bit about too that, you know, as people in the 20th century and in 20th century New England, we are the inheritors of this transition to the professionalization and commodification of death. That is what we inherited. And so the Civil War doesn't just shift practices and how the dead are treated, it also shifts notions of who should die. And as Drew Gilpin Faust argues in her excellent study, This Republic of Suffering, Death in the American Civil War, mid-19th century Americans actually endured a high rate of infant mortality, but expected that most individuals would survive at least until middle age. The war took young, healthy men and rapidly, often instantly, destroyed them with disease or with injury. And so this marked a really sharp and rather alarming departure from existing preconceptions about who should die. The old were expected to die, and so were the young in this era. But if you made it out of that era, that expectation was no longer there. And so in myriad ways, the Civil War totally upends this notion of a good death, where you died at home surrounded by your family. And it really resigned you to like accept your imminent demise. And so we can see all of these tensions and disruptions on display in an 1863 letter in the Brickstore Museum collections that was written by Sarah Emery of Kennebunk to her husband, Isaac, who was away fighting the Civil War as part of the 20th century Maine. And I paired this with a really popular Harper's Weekly centerfold cartoon that Winslow Homer did in 1862 called News from the War. And it features the mail train, the Pony Express, how people are getting news, bugle calls, but it also very prominently features a grieving woman holding a letter. And it's this part of this illustration that I wanted to point out. So let's listen to this very short letter between Sarah Emery and her husband.
A letter from Sarah to her husband, Isaac, written. Ordnance Sergeant Isaac M. Emery, Company 1.27, Maine Regiment, Washington, D.C., postmark, February 24, Kennebunkport. Kennebunk, February 22nd, 1863. My dear husband, I seat myself tonight to write you a very few lines on a very painful subject, to inform you that my poor old father is dead, the last parent gone to rest, and I am left an orphan. He died this morning about 4:30. He was cutting wood at the door yesterday afternoon and was taken sick with the numb palsy while there, and died very sudden. He will be buried next Tuesday afternoon. I shall go over to the funeral if I can leave home, and we are all well. Your brother John came over this afternoon to inform us of the sad tidings and carried Mary Ellen home. She feels dreadfully, and I feel lonely enough having you absent and all my brothers gone too. I am doomed to trouble. Charles is away to sea, sick. I expect every day to hear that he is dead. But my dear, I can bear this trouble very well, compared with your dying. When John came in and said that he had bad news for us, I was afraid something had happened to you. I feel thankful it is no worse. Sis Burgess is with me now and will stay until Mary Ellen comes back. Sis Rankins is better. I received your letter last Thursday with Lucinda's ring. She was much obliged to you and much pleased. The children are all well and all the rest of your folks. There, my dear, I must close. I will write you again soon and hope to hear from you soon. And may this find you alive and well. So, good night, dear, from your devoted wife, Sarah E. Emery.
There's so much to say about this letter, and I was really struck just listening to it. Now, with all of you, how many times, I mean, there's so many jokes about, I hope this email finds you well. But when she's saying that, I mean, she really means it. She hopes it finds her husband well and alive. And this letter illuminates so much about the lives of 19th century women on the home front. She's upset that her father died, but that death is still expected because he's older. But she says she's constantly worrying. All her brothers are gone. Her husband is away. And notice that she's talking about all of these women who will come to sit with her and help her process this grief that they are all collectively experiencing together, but also constantly waiting for this letter, for this news from the war, which is why it factors so prominently in Homer's image. And so I really, if you haven't read this Republic of Suffering, I really recommend it. But I also recommend an older book, French historian Philip Aries' like very classic 1974 study, Western Attitudes Towards Death from the Middle Ages to the Present. And in the 1970s, it was true then, it's more true now, 40 plus years later. He argues that contemporary Americans and Europeans have lost both a connection and an understanding and acceptance of death, further trying to shunt it away and to deny its inevitability. And so he writes, in the 19th century, death appeared omnipresent. Funeral processions, mourning clothes, the spread of cemeteries and their surface area, visits and pilgrimages to tombs, the cult of memory. But did this pomp not hide the weakening of old familiarities, which alone were really deeply rooted? In any case, this eloquent decor of death toppled in our day, and death has become unnameable. Everything henceforth goes on as if neither I nor those who are dear to me are any longer mortal. Technically, we admit that we might die. We take out insurance on our lives to protect our families from poverty. But really, at heart, we feel we are non-mortals. And surprise, our life is not, as a result, gladdened. So he's really arguing that this pushing away of death, taking it out of the home, out of the family, is what alienates us from it. And we're not better for it. The pandemic brought us back to that brink of alienation from death because we were surrounded by it every day in a way that in the United States, not many of us had been in our lifetimes. So death and grief, both public and private, are really different in our modern era of hospitals, of elder care facilities, hospice, funeral homes, funeral parlors, palliative care. Stages of grief are well known, but the marking of our mourning periods are less pronounced. We still attend wakes and funerals. We bake goods and dinners for grieving families. We mail and email and increasingly text messages of condolence and sympathy to friends and family. We purchase flowers. We post on Facebook memorial pages. We donate to charitable causes in honor of the deceased. But in contrast to the extended and ritualistic mourning periods of the 19th century, it appears that in the 21st century, we are expected to take a brief bereavement leave of perhaps a week or so, rapidly get over these deaths, and move on with our lives. And that expectation doesn't reckon with at all what loss really is to people. How can you possibly go from having a mourning period of 9 to 12 months in the 19th century and go to a period of 5 business days of mourning? The First and Second World Wars have a lot to do with that. So does late stage capitalism, but that's another talk too. But I would say it's that marking of that's it, that's what you get, that's what we'll pay you to do. And it goes so much beyond that. But I think that it's easier said than done. And I think especially in this pandemic era, right, where it was in March of 2022 that the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, actually added a new diagnosis of prolonged grief disorder. And I think it was no accident that prolonged grief disorder, after many years of arguing about it, was actually added 2 years into the pandemic. And prolonged grief describes people who are still more than 1 year after experiencing loss, unable to return to everyday activities. And all of this is happening during a time, especially in lockdown and social distancing during 2020 and 2021, where people could not engage in the rituals of mourning, like wakes, funerals, celebrations of life. We couldn't even hug other people for so many. I mean, think about it. It was like years. I mean, I didn't hug my parents for like 2 years or a year and a half. That's crazy. Like, it's the human comfort that we also want so much during these times, and we couldn't access that. As USM Professor Emerita Artis Cameron remarked in an op-ed for the Portland Press Herald a month or so ago, grief seems to be having a public comeback. Good. It's a really interesting op-ed, and it is really timely and is deeply linked to what I'm thinking about here in this talk. What does it mean for grief to have a public comeback? And Kartika, I see your note in the chat about why this is identified as a disorder. That's a big part of the arguments around adding it, is that why is grief of longer than a year? It's not a disorder, it's natural. And so I think that's further attempt to kind of quantify it. And so as we delve into some of these specific customs and practices and how they evolve over time, let's keep to mind that they are really governed by social standing, social class, race, ethnicity, religion, and even region. And so in regional customs in New England differ from those in other areas. In 1894, Alice Morse Earle wrote Customs and Fashions of Old New England, and she has a whole chapter, a fascinating chapter on funeral and burial customs. And she gives this anecdote about Londonderry, New Hampshire, which I give you this very badly reproduced map. Not from my own collections, it would be much better if it was. So she writes, in Londonderry, New Hampshire, a neighboring town settled by Scotch-Irish planters, the announcement of death was a signal for the cessation of daily work throughout the neighborhood. Kindly assistance was at once given at the house of mourning. Women flocked to do the household work and to prepare the funeral feast. Men brought gifts of food or household necessities and rendered all the advice and help that was needed. A gathering was held the night before the funeral, in which feasting and drinking partook somewhat of the nature of an Irish wake. Much New England rum was consumed at this gathering, and also before the procession to the grave. And after the interment, the whole party returned to the house for an arval and drank again. The funeral rum bill was often an embarrassing and hampering expense to a bereaved family for years. This liberal serving of intoxicating liquor at a funeral was not particular to these New Hampshire towns nor to the Scotch-Irish, but prevailed in every settlement in the colonies until the temperance awakening days of the 19th century. And it's really interesting how social reform movements also alter the customs of death. But this communal nature of funerals in New England is really emphasized in a wide variety of both pre and post Civil War American fiction. And I'm always struck by chapter 4 of Sarah Orne Jewett's Country of the Pointed Firs, which is set in the fictional village of Dunnett's Landing, much like Berwick, where she was from. And so her young narrator, who is from away, is trying to write in her rented schoolhouse. And she's doing this while she's reflecting on a funeral she attended earlier that morning for Mrs. Begg, another character in the book, who was a local woman. And so she explains to the reader, the services had taken place at 1 o'clock, and now at 2:15, I stood at the schoolhouse window, looking down at the procession as it went along the lower road close to the shore. It was a walking funeral. And even at that distance, I could recognize most of the mourners as they went their solemn way. Mrs. Begg had been very much respected, and there was a large company of friends following her to the grave. The intimate and communal nature of the walking funeral that this narrator observes from her window really sets her apart from the townsfolk and only really cements her outsider status. For the first time, I began to wish for a companion and for news of the outer world, which had been half unconsciously forgotten. Watching the funeral gave one a sort of pain. I began to wonder if I ought not to have walked with the rest, instead of hurrying away at the end of the services. Perhaps the Sunday gown I had put on for the occasion was making this disastrous change of feeling, but I had now made myself and my friends remember that I did not really belong to Dunnet Landing. And this emphasis on community and the interdependence of community members persisted into the 20th century, as you can see in this image on the screen, which is of a walking funeral procession in Fort Kent in 1912. It's still alive and well in many parts of Maine, but modern life has led to more of an emphasis on the individual. And so it's really rare these days to see an entire community stop to observe and to collectively mourn the passing of one of its departed members to the extent that's described in these anecdotes. a lot of the practices we're looking at together were really decidedly middle class. And one's ability to participate in some of these rituals, particularly like the commissioning and wearing of elaborate jewelry or buying full mourning dress, were significant signifiers of social standing. But I also want to note that mourning was really gendered. And the actions and the behaviors of women in mourning as Republican mothers or as the moral center of the family were expected to set the tone for the entire family's public and private display of grief. To put this another way, it's women who often bear the burdens of mourning. And so this is true, especially in public and across social classes. Mourning practices were actually scrutinized by others, and you could be judged, and you were judged. For instance, if you didn't wear your full mourning garb for an appropriate period of time, or if you appeared at a social gathering or a concert that wasn't deemed appropriate for someone in mourning. So as much as I remain nostalgic for some of these performative markers of grief because I think they would help us a lot in our modern times, I don't believe that you should be able to dictate someone else's grief, right? Like, oh, it's 9 months, you can't put on that yet, or how dare you go listen to music to make you feel better? You're not supposed to do that. So we see this in etiquette manuals. And Mary Elizabeth Wilson Sherwood writes a guide to etiquette, manners, and social usages that's published by Harper in New York in 1887. And she says, in this country, no person in mourning for a parent, a child, a brother, or a husband is expected to be seen at a concert, a dinner party, a party, or at any other place of public amusement before 3 months have passed. After that, one may be seen at a concert, but to go to the opera or a dinner or a party before 6 months have elapsed is considered heartless and disrespectful. Indeed, a deep mourning dress at such place is an unpleasant anomaly. If one chooses, as many do, not to wear mourning, then they can go unchallenged to any place of amusement, as they have asserted their right to be independent. But if they put on mourning, they must respect its etiquette. And I find that to be really an interesting commentary in this manual. If you put it on in a public way, you follow the rules. She says, it's deemed almost a sin for a woman to go into the street, to drive or to walk for 2 years without a deep crepe veil over her face. It's a common remark of the censorious that a person who lightens her mourning before that time, quote, did not care much for the deceased. And many people hold the fact that a widow or an orphan wears her crepe for 2 years to be greatly to her credit. Doesn't say anything about his credit, to her credit. There were rules for mourning, and if you were in polite society, you were expected to know them and to perform the rituals for the appropriate length of time. But this requires money, and it requires a certain amount of leisure time, and these were two things that most working class folks did not have. Many working class men and women wanted to avoid the shame and stigma of a burial in a potter's field, where they might be wrapped in a plain shroud and buried without ceremony, sometimes in a mass grave, with only a number as a marker. And to kind of allay some of these fears, trade unions and fraternal organizations started offering, as many still do actually, both burial benefits and insurance that would ensure provisions for funeral and a proper burial for their families. So traditions of home wakes and visiting hours actually persisted in the working classes far longer than they did in middle and upper class families, even through the mid-20th century. And I call your attention to this really interesting picture where at first glance, you're like, why are you showing me this photograph of a kitchen when we're talking about mourning practices? But if you look through the door into the dining room, you will see a deceased laid out on the table with the coffin underneath. You can see his hand in the cufflinks just outside the door. And this is 1927. This is a home funeral, a part of day-to-day and everyday life. These persisted longer in Maine than other parts of the country, as many rural traditions did. So they never quite disappear. but it really is, you rarely see these kinds of things photographed in the 20th century. Death is understood in this time period, and especially around the Civil War, as part of the context of like a really highly sentimental culture where you emphasize emotion, the overt display of emotions and feelings, and we might today like really note this as melodramatic. The most popular example of this sentimental culture is actually written in Maine by Harriet Beecher Stowe, in her book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, at the scene where little Eva dies. And so in this part of the book, we witness like both the good death and the emotionalism and the sentimentality. And it's really interesting to contrast this with the more minimal displays of mourning that come out of the 1700s. And you might look at these Victorian era practices as more lavish and somewhat overwrought. So I want to take you through now into just looking at some material culture, into looking at some of the different types of mourning, to put these objects and the mourning practices together. And we'll kind of do it a little bit chronologically. These are mourning rings. They tended to be given in funerals, particularly in wealthy families, to near relatives and persons of note in the community. So they're made of gold. Sometimes they also have etchings in black. They often have crossed skulls on them, or whole skeletons or death's heads. They usually have the initials of the dead on them, as well as the date of their death. And you can, people bought, sometimes really wealthy families bought dozens of these rings to be given out as mementos to the dead. And then they sent the bills to the principals of the mourning family. And so you also see more simple examples here. This was actually a mourning ring that Paul Revere made for the funeral of Reverend Samuel Dunbar of Canton, Massachusetts in 1783, at the very end of the Revolution. In the Revolutionary era in New England, especially Massachusetts, it was also really common to give gloves and scarves to mourners to be worn at funerals. And sometimes you actually sent gloves as an invitation to come to a funeral. So this was extremely ritualistic, but it was also incredibly expensive. So much so that in New England in the 1740s, and actually the Continental Congress takes this up again in the 1770s, they passed this act that essentially says, no scarves, glove, except 6 pairs to those who are going to bear the coffin. Wine, rum, or rings shall be allowed and given at any funeral upon penalty of 50 pounds, because this practice was bankrupting people. And it was so socialized. So you see this come in and out during the colonial era. And although they tried to legislate it out, you weren't gonna, it persisted and it continued. And I think you really continue to see this in the very public mourning and response to George Washington's death in December of 1799, because it's this collective expression of grief. Even when he's mourned in Virginia and DC and laid to rest, people stage mock funerals for Washington all around the country, even here in Portland. This is a mourning armband for his death in the collections of the Maine Historical Society. And so it really kind of ushers in this new era of public mourning that's signified by both what people are creating and what they're wearing. And I want to just feature these beautiful memorials made by women, often very young women, in honor of the dead. Many of these are made by schoolgirls in academies. This is Betsy Abbey's piece. She's 16. This is a silk, so it's painted on silk and embroidered. This is for her father in Windham County, Connecticut, in 1804. She's a student at the Lydia Royce School. And I just want to show you how beautifully wrought and elaborate this is. But it's also a way of grieving. So you see all the different, like the crewel work over here, the different sorts of embroidery, then the painting right here as well. So she's showing off her skill, but she's also making this really beautiful piece. And so you can see these pieces that were made in memory, often of parents, often of other loved ones, painted on silk, deeply embroidered. You see all of the trappings of 19th century mourning practices. You've got the weeping willow, you have the urn, the vine, you're out in nature at the same time that garden cemeteries are becoming really popular, like Mount Auburn in Massachusetts, or here closer to home in Portland, you've got the Evergreen Cemetery, which is a 19th century garden cemetery. The same time that poets like William Cullen Bryant are writing pieces like Thanatopsis, where he's meditating on death as a 17-year-old. And if you look at these images, you begin to see this public mourning and grief, but also something that could stay with the family. So if you couldn't go and visit the grave, you could visit and commune with this person every day in your house. This is a beautiful one from the Portland Museum of Art. Susan Merrill, age 20, the memorial to Mrs. Lydia Emery. So she has that expression of grief here, the urn and the vines, the weeping willow, and then the woman leaning on an anchor. An anchor was a symbol of grounding the dead here, right, as they're ascending. So she's pointing to heaven while deeply grounding still here on earth. And what's so amazing, I mean, as a photo historian, these are the things I really look for. This is in the collections of historic New England, but here's a parlor. You know, this is the 1920s. This is a parlor in Danversport, Massachusetts at the Samuel Fowler House. And if you look up at the top of the parlor, all of these are these mourning embroideries, some of which would have been made 70, 80, and 90, 100 years before. And so you can see that these finely wrought images are being kept in families. And these memorials are constantly being visited. And you can see this again and again, and it repeats itself in these more simple memorial drawings. This one's from 1839 from the collections of the Maine Historical Society. It's a memorial drawing for Francis Small, the son of Daniel and Julia. He was only 1 year old, and you can see the great grief here with the weeping willow and the death's head. You can see a printed version here, a lithograph that you could actually fill in. You could purchase one and write in the name of your departed and hang it on the wall. Here is, it's not always women. Here's a mourning picture of a man standing by a gravestone reading in 1840 from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. And so you continually see these images of mourning, which are sometimes also worn, drawn and worn around people's necks, like this mourning pendant from 1775. This locket actually commemorates the death of Mercy Wiswall and her daughter, who lived in Portland, but died in the pneumonia epidemic in Boston in that era. So a lot of these pieces of jewelry contain hair, and that becomes really important to mourning practices in the 19th century. They're really sentimental because they like physically represent the emotional state, and they permanently connect you to the presence of the deceased. When you are wearing jewelry made of hair on your body and rings, earrings, pendants, necklaces, bracelets, watch chains, brooches, cufflinks, you are openly demonstrating your physical grief. And this is well before our modern notions tell us that hair and other things from the body are dirty or impure or unclean. And this literally keeps the dead among the living, just like mourning photography does. And hair jewelry is not just for mourning. It's often also given as tokens of love and remembrance. So like perhaps when you're first dating your boyfriend, he gives you a lock of his hair on a watch chain, or vice versa, like keeping that other person close. Hair working is very professional. We see this in a lot of catalogs that people are getting. So it's really interesting if you look at those images in the case from the Brickstore Museum's collection, and you look at the shapes, and then you look at these catalogs, you can see how people were ordering these very specific hair work designs. and how much it would cost, how much to mount it, how much to braid it, and then how much a total piece would be. So if you look at something like 267, this small brooch right here, it was $3.75 to mount, 50 cents to braid, for a total of $4.25, which was not a small amount of money in that time. It was quite expensive to get this done. But it's also a way in which people make their living. And even as late as the late 19th century in Maine, there's at least one hair worker in every Maine county. And in fact, Edna St. Vincent Millay's mother, she was born and raised in Rockland, was a hair worker. That's how she provided for her daughters. So this tradition really persists for quite a while. I want to end just by talking about mourning photography and portraiture in this way. And so when photography comes into this, right, this is just a continuation of the tradition of those mourning drawings and embroideries that we saw. When it comes in 1839 in France, when Daguerre invents the process, it gets invented in England too in a different way, but this comes across very quickly to the United States and Maine. We've got photographers in Maine by 1840, and almost immediately, this practice of photographing the dead is really popular in this highly sentimental culture, because it allows your loved one to be present with you, even after they're gone. And it's not uncommon to look behind these cases and find hair, right? Like locks of hair in these daguerreotype cases. This is one of the more beautiful postmortem portraits I've ever seen of Mrs. William Herbert of Bangor. It's really early, it's 1843, and it's in the collections of Maine Historical. And it's meant to look like she is sleeping. In all of the manuals for photographers that come out during this time, they are absolutely told that people should look as if they are sleeping. You are often also going to see a lot of mourning portraits of deceased children. This is not uncommon, and they were not hidden away. These really surprise my students when I show them to them. This is from about 1850. It's a postmortem portrait of Johnny. The difficult thing for me about this image is that it was taken by Johnny's dad. So he's a daguerreotype photographer making his living in this way, and he does the same thing for his own family and for his own son, which shows you how common the practice really is, and it persists. As more circulable forms of photography come into play, people get multiple copies printed, and they send these to friends and family. This is still a practice. There's many photographers who travel to hospitals and neonatal wards to take photographs of parents and their child, which is a precious remembrance that really serves the same emotional purposes now as it did then, but it's a hidden practice. Many people don't know about it, whereas everyone would have known about this in the 19th century. People also performed their family grief. Here's a mother holding her deceased child. He died of dysentery, Braintree, Massachusetts in 1855. Here's a portrait of sisters in Salem, Massachusetts from 1895. So she's literally holding a rosary and wilting flowers, staring at the camera in black next to her angelic deceased sister. But this is from a studio. I mean, this is something that would have been circulated and performed and not hidden away. But families also marked their grief together, particularly fathers and children. Both of these are from Maine Historical. And so here is a grieving father and two grieving sons for the loss of their mother, potentially in childbirth, which was so common during this era. And so to round out these practices, we just look a little bit at mourning dress and clothing. And there's so many etiquette books that are published about this. And women, as we were looking at before, were prescribed to wear these for years at a time, down to the trimmings on the bustle the designs were in etiquette manuals. What kind of crepe, how many layers, how long the veil should be, what you should wear at any given time, what your shawl should look like, what the veil should look like, how long you should keep it on, when you should go to gray, when you should put a white collar on, when you move into the third stages of mourning where you can put a white bonnet or shawl or a light purple or a lavender dress before you transition back into color. And so it's really all of these magazines aimed at female audiences like Harper's Bazaar and others had huge layouts on what these women should wear. So here you see someone in deep mourning, and to the right, you see someone in the last stage of grief or mourning. This is a great, Stephanie, this is a great question that you put in the chat about like Rent the Runway. You could borrow some things, but if everyone's in mourning, especially during a time period like the Civil War, it would be much harder. And so it's incredibly cost prohibitive. And you're expected to wear this every day. So it's not like you could borrow something just for the funeral. You're expected to be in this for like 6 to 12 months. And so there are whole catalogs where people can order. Like this is a Boston catalog on Winter Street from the Family Mourning Store, exclusively for mourning clothing. Mantillas, gloves, handkerchiefs, dress trimmings, caps, veils, hats, English crepes, all of these things. Notice there's like 2 things for men because they were just expected to wear like maybe a black suit or an armband or a black hat. That was it, mostly the armband. So women would make these simple black dresses, right? But then they would also purchase all of these goods. And this is actually a mourning outfit in the collections of the Brickstore Museum that totally conforms to like this same style that you're seeing it. And so it's really interesting when you think about the way in which these affected people. There are all these warnings against not wearing them too long for your living children, because it's really hard to see your mom in black all the time and like with a veil over her face, like mourning a lost child when you're still alive. It's also very clear from the etiquette manuals that these really helped people work through grief until it became an overly burdensome obligation. So like keeping up with that etiquette was really difficult, but it was also something you could hide behind. And it really comes out of fashion by World War I. You can see that here. This is a Vogue magazine article from 1916. The laws of mourning are here set down in black and white. Like they make these models look kind of sad and emaciated. But how can you keep up this custom when 10+ million people are dead from a really brutal modern war? So that's what like the scale of mourning is what actually ushers so many of these practices out. So I appreciate you hanging with me for this long, and I'll kind of make my final point that grief, as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, is making a comeback. And I think as ever, it's artists and poets who help us reimagine grief and loss in the modern era. This is Maine contemporary photographer Sig Harvey's work. This is one of her recent photo books called Blue Violet. And if you looked at it, you wouldn't necessarily know it was about mourning, but in an interview, at the end of the interview, she says, as I mentioned, this book is all flowers, but it's not about flowers. It's about being and dying. My best friend was dying, and this is what I sent her. That's about as serious as it gets. And then I would also mention, and I really want to wrap up with this question that's been really nagging at me for more than a decade. And so I want to ask, what have we collectively lost as individuals, as communities, with the falling away of these mourning traditions, many of which are gone by World War I? And this question became even more poignant to me during the pandemic. And I would say that perhaps our greatest loss is a lack of a symbolic way to signify and demonstrate our grief, to let others know without overtly telling them that we are suffering a loss, and we are suffering a loss that may take time to heal. it's worth mentioning, and your presence today really solidifies that there's a resurgence of interest in mourning customs and traditions, dress and jewelry, and even the portraiture of mourning, as you can see in this incredibly poignant 2020 self-mourning portrait of the Portland photographer Megan Jones. And I want to really thank Megan, I think she may be here, for letting me use this deeply personal and very poignant photograph that she took, both as part of her own practice, but as part of her own mourning for a very significant loss. And it's marking in this way, connecting across centuries and traditions, and really meditating on how does this help us move through things? Why is grief coming back, right? Why is it more present or public in this way? Are we hungry for tradition? Are we ready to reckon with death as something to accept as a natural part of life? Do we wish to have more time to grieve? Do we want to find ways to more tangibly express this? And I think particularly like in a world that's like ever connected and plugged in and fast paced, are we really just hungering for more community interaction and involvement and the possibility of slowing down, of extending the timeline of grief and mourning, and not looking at the timeline as like, once you hit 12 months, now you have a grief disorder. It doesn't work like that. I think the pandemic really changed notions of time for us. So this all really bears a lot of thinking about. I'm going to leave it there and welcome your thoughts in the chat and everywhere else. And thank you so much. There's a lot of things in the chat. Thank you for your very kind comments. I am happy to answer any questions. I encourage people to weave in and out as you need to. I know it's a snowy day. I really see a lot of people thinking and talking about how grief doesn't have a timeline. And I think that's a really important thing to take away with us. I think my colleague Paula has her hand raised. So Paula, go ahead. You can unmute if you want.
Oh, hi, Libby. Thanks for this. This was great, especially on a nice snowy day. A couple things strike me. One, the talk of the hair, and an interesting part of pet bereavement is that in this process of euthanizing the dog, veterinary providers not only part of it is, of course, the ashes, but also an imprint of the paw, and they clip hair from the dogs. So I thought that was interesting. In some ways, I think while it's disenfranchised grief, it's also a grief that feels, when it is experienced and experienced among others, kind of raw and unfiltered. When it's shared with people who understand and don't think, as my oncologist says, nobody tells you you can get another dad. Right? And so I think we have something to learn from what's happening in that process. And then the other point was, while I understand why I'm part of the profession that in the DSM-5, that I understand the good intentions of it, but I also think labeling grief in a category of a disorder is extremely problematic. And I understand they're looking for insurance reimbursement. So this kind of late stage capitalist remark permeates this whole conversation in modern grief of get on, move on. And which is why I ditched the Kubler-Ross stages of grief for continuous bonds theory, which actually recognizes ritual, and while not as institutionalized or formalized as some of these historic gestures, it says, your ritual can be anything. And it opens the door more for that sense of that it's something you move with and move on from. So I think the meditations on this and the conversations about this against the COVID backdrop, I hope will take us through a different portal on what we have to do, what we need to do from this experience, either individually, familially, or collectively. So thanks a lot for this talk. It was really great. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Paula. Paula's an artist and a social worker, a community practitioner, and also teaches a lot about bereavement and grief, particularly with pets. And I think Paula gives us an important reminder that we can grieve many living things, right? It isn't just people where we experience this grief and this loss. And I'm seeing some really fascinating comments in the chat. Julia says one of the contemporary versions of public mourning that really fascinates them are roadside memorials, especially as they relate to looking at beliefs about who is supposed to die, since so many are for young people. And I feel like roadside memorials are like a whole other aspect of things, but also a very public way of grieving. And you absolutely have some other people responding to you in the chat, Julia, with their own feelings about those. Linda talks about mourning wreaths. The Brickstore Museum, I also believe, has some of those in their collection. And those are fascinating as a 19th century practice because they often weave together entire families' hair in like a collective expression of birth and death and like life coming full circle. The most spectacular one I've ever seen from Maine is up in Presque Isle at the Historical Society. But that's like home hair work that people really take into account. And I think it's really interesting. Martha, I just want to tell other people about what you're putting in the chat about a forthcoming anthology called Who We Lost, a portable COVID memorial with more than 40 stories by COVID bereaved folks. And I'm really interested to read that. And it's really interesting to hear your comment about how that resonates with the motifs that I was talking about today from the 19th century that are appearing in these very common stories. Marilee and other folks are talking about like there is no timeline to grief, but especially in the pandemic. And I think that piece about especially in the pandemic is really how my thinking has changed on this. I lost all sense of time during the pandemic and I haven't gained it back. And as a historian, like I actually no longer believe in linear time. I really believe now in this like very circular time. And it's been interesting in thinking about grief because it doesn't need to have an end. It can really stay with us. And Marilee's point about modern grief only has a timeline for those who are not sure how to assist those or who in mourning. And I think it's that notion that really inspired like versions of this talk over the past decade, is really encouraging people to not shy away from helping people in their grief, whether that's a card or asking people what they need or cooking a meal, and continuing to check in on folks, particularly on anniversaries, which are often so very hard for people, right? And I think we've seen a lot of public sharing and grieving around those things because of the pandemic. And Carl Little talks about the phenomenon of the dead remaining on Facebook. And this is really interesting, like across all sorts of socioeconomic, but also generational categories. I have had students who have very tragically passed away, some by their own hand, and those accounts remain up as a way in which their friends can come back and talk about the person annually. I've seen this quite a bit, or like check in with them. But it is a way of keeping, like, can you keep an online presence alive once the physical presence is really gone? And Ashley put in the chat that there was a precursor to these memorials from 1995 called cemetery.org. And so these public rituals, you know, I think, Darlene, just as we kind of wrap up today, I really appreciate your comment. As a community, we are grieving community and human connection. Many are questioning what is the best way to grieve, right? And that this grief really never ends. It's just a new reality that changes over time. Karen talks about the analogy of a grief ball that she's seen online. I think this human connection and not leaving people in isolation is really so important. And I think for me, those signifiers of grief is something I wish that we would see come back in some way. whether it's a black armband or something else, but it only worked because nearly everyone did it. Right. And there were many other things that I didn't talk about. There were calling cards that people left that marked that you were in mourning. Your stationery that you wrote on every day was rimmed in black while you were mourning. I mean, everything you publicly did signified what you were going through. And I think it also let people know there was a story there and a loss there without having constantly to be asked and to retell that story again and again and again, which for some people would be very helpful and for others would be tremendously painful. And I think for me, it's like really not leaving these people in isolation, as Elizabeth says in the chat, but really coming together as a community to take care of our own and also to recognize that everybody is grieving, particularly in pandemic times, all kinds of losses all the time, and to give people some grace as that's happening and to really keep heart and remind ourselves of that. So I'm going to close there. I want to thank everyone. I want to thank our interpreters, the Maine Humanities Council, the Brickstore Museum, and Cynthia, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you so much, Libby. And I also want to thank you, Liz Sinclair and the Maine Humanities Council and our wonderful interpreters today for bringing us together this afternoon for a topic that we all share and relate to. I hope you'll plan on taking part in the museum's upcoming programs. As I said, this is going to be a year-long project to collect everyone's examples or suggestions and input on how we remember people. And that will build towards our community exhibit starting about a year from now. So to follow along with that and what's going on and join in when you can, visit brickstoremuseum.org, where we'll post updates and sessions to take part in. Please consider supporting the Maine Humanities Council for their important work throughout the state, supporting programs and museums like ours. And I thank you all once again and enjoy the snow out there. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye. Stay safe out there.